Every death in this video was one Google search away from being avoided. 10 amateurs looked at extreme sports designed to kill professionals and said, "Yeah, I don't need lessons for that." Spoiler, they did. These are the dumbest, most preventable, most spectacularly stupid amateur extreme sport deaths we've ever covered. And honestly, number 8 broke my brain. Let's get into it. 1. Let's kick things off with a trip to a snowy mountain resort, a place usually reserved for skiing, snowboarding, and paying $12 for a cup of lukewarm cocoa. But for two thrill seekers, let's call them Dennis and Vlad, the designated trails were simply too pedestrian. They were looking for an adrenaline rush that didn't just tickle the senses but actively assaulted them. Their vehicle of choice? The Zorb. For the uninitiated, a Zorb is essentially a giant, transparent hamster ball made of PVC. In a controlled environment, like a gentle, grassy slope with a safety net and a juice bar at the bottom, it's a nauseating but safe amusement park ride. But Dennis and Vlad looked at the safe track and decided it was for cowards. They wanted the free ride experience. They managed to convince an operator, whose understanding of liability insurance was seemingly non-existent, to let them launch the ball down a completely uncleared, ungroomed, and terrifyingly steep section of the mountain. Now, anyone who passed high school physics, or anyone who has ever rolled a marble across a kitchen floor, knows that a sphere on a frictionless surface is a recipe for chaos. The plan was, theoretically, to roll down the snow and stop naturally at the bottom. Naturally in this context meant whenever gravity got bored. They strapped themselves inside the ball, harnessed in like astronauts on a budget mission to Mars, and gave the thumbs up. The launch was spectacular for about 4 seconds. The ball picked up speed, a lot of speed. You see, on a groomed track, friction and barriers keep you in line. On an open mountain face, the Zorb became a 500-pound pinball with 2 screaming humans rattling around inside like loose change in a dryer. The bystanders, filming on their phones, went from cheering, "Woo!" to a horrified silence faster than you can say lawsuit. The ball didn't just roll, it began to bounce. And when a 12-foot sphere hits a patch of ice at 40 miles per hour, it doesn't slow down. It accelerates. The Zorb veered violently off the intended path, which was imaginary to begin with, and headed straight for a rocky gorge that was definitely not on the brochure. Inside, Dennis and Vlad were experiencing a centrifugal nightmare, spinning so fast their internal organs were playing musical chairs. The ball hit a jagged rock outcrop, launching into the air like a majestic, transparent beach ball of doom. It cleared the safety berms, cleared the spectators, and plummeted into a deep, rocky ravine several hundred feet below. The impact was catastrophic. The ball didn't cushion the blow. It just ensured they bounced all the way to the crime scene. Rescue teams eventually found them, but there was nothing to be done. It was a tragedy, yes, but also a grim physics lesson. If you encase yourself in a giant bubble and throw yourself off a mountain, you aren't an extreme athlete. You're just expensive cargo with no brakes. They wanted a ride they would never forget, and technically they got one. Right up until the sudden rocky stop that served as the final punctuation mark on their decision-making skills. 2. The internet has truly democratized the ability to make terrible life choices. In the old days, you had to know a guy to get dangerous equipment. Now you just need a credit card and a shipping address. Meet Ethan, a man who watched 3 hours of GoPro footage on YouTube and decided he was basically a bird. Ethan was fascinated by speed flying, a high-octane sport that combines paragliding with skiing, where pilots scream down mountains at 60 inches from the ground. It requires expert skiing ability, expert paragliding experience, and reflexes sharper than a razor. Ethan had none of these. What he did have was an Amazon Prime account and an ego the size of the mountain he was about to jump off. He ordered a high-performance Speedwing, a tiny, aggressive parachute designed for experts. When it arrived, he skipped the manual, which likely contained boring words like death, die, and dying, and headed straight for a notorious launch site in the Alps. Real pilots were there, checking wind gradients and barometric pressure. Ethan was checking his selfie angle. He strapped into the harness, which felt reassuringly snug, giving him a false sense of security that the equipment would do the flying for him. He didn't understand that a speed wing has the glide ratio of a brick with ambitions. He set up on the edge of a jagged cliff, the wind whipping his face, whispering warnings he ignored. He inflated the wing. It snapped up with violent energy, lifting him off his feet. "I'm doing it," he probably thought, right before reality kicked in. He launched. For 2 glorious seconds, he was flying. But here's the thing about speed wings. They are sensitive. A regular paraglider turns like a bus. A speed wing turns like a Formula One car. Ethan, used to video games, yanked the right toggle to bank a turn. A seasoned pilot would have used a millimeter of input. Ethan used a fistful. The wing didn't just turn, it dove. It snapped into a vicious spiral dive, converting all his altitude into raw, terrifying velocity. He wasn't flying anymore. He was falling with style. The ground, which was supposed to be a scenic backdrop, became a rapidly approaching wall of granite. He didn't even have time to deploy a reserve chute, mostly because he hadn't bought one, figuring he wouldn't need it if he just flew good. He impacted the slope at highway speeds, a collision that physics dictates has 0 survival rate. The forensic report likely noted that while his gear was brand new and perfectly functional, the organic component operating it, specifically the brain, was defective. Ethan proved that while you can buy the wings, you cannot buy the skills to keep them from burying you. 3. There is a fine line between thrifty DIY enthusiast and candidate for the Darwin Award, and our next hero, let's call him Gary, didn't just cross that line, he rappelled down it using dental floss. Gary wanted to get into ice climbing, a sport that involves scaling frozen waterfalls using axes and crampons. It's a noble pursuit, usually requiring about $1,000 in specialized steel gear. Gary, however, was a man who believed big climbing was just trying to rip him off. He looked at a professional ice axe, precision-milled, laser-cut, tempered chromoly steel, and then he looked at the rusty garden hose in his shed. "Same shape," he muttered, displaying a profound misunderstanding of both geometry and metallurgy. He spent a weekend in his garage with an angle grinder, transforming 2 innocent gardening tools into what he called the Terminators. He sharpened the flat blades into points, duct-taped the wooden handles for grip, and declared himself ready for the ascent. He drove to a popular frozen crag where actual climbers were gearing up with carbon fiber and Gore-Tex. They stared at Gary. Gary stared back, radiating the confidence of a man who has no idea he is already dead. He approached a 60-foot vertical pillar of ice. He swung his first modified hoe. Thunk. It stuck. "See?" he thought, vindicated. He swung the second. Thunk. He began to climb. The problem, which any material scientist could have told him, is that garden hose are made of mild steel designed to move soft dirt, not to support a 180-pound man hanging by his wrists from a vertical glacier. As he ascended, the metal was undergoing a process called plastic deformation. It was bending, microscopically at first, then catastrophically. He reached the 40-foot mark, high enough that the ground looked like a theoretical concept. He winded up for a big swing to reach the next ledge. He planted the left hoe. He shifted his weight onto it to move the right one. That was the moment the garden tool decided it was tired of being an ice axe. The metal didn't just slip, it sheared. The head of the hoe snapped clean off the handle. Suddenly, Gary was holding a stick. Gravity, sensing an opportunity, took hold of his waist. He fell backward, the second hoe ripping out of the ice because, surprise, it wasn't designed for shock loading either. Gary plummeted 40 feet, a screaming testament to the importance of proper gear ratings. He landed on the hard-packed ice at the base, an impact that turned his internal monologue into a dial tone. He died doing what he loved, saving money. Unfortunately, the $20 he saved on gear cost him about 40 years of living. It was a tragic end, but let's be honest. When you bring a garden tool to a mountain fight, the mountain is going to win every single time. 4. Let's talk about the specific brand of arrogance that usually accompanies a midlife crisis or a sudden influx of disposable income. This brings us to Kevin, a man whose previous maritime experience was limited to floating on a novelty pizza slice in a hotel pool. Kevin decided that kayaking looked like a fantastic way to connect with nature, specifically the angry, frothing, violent part of nature known as a Class 5 river. Now, for those who prefer their water in a glass, a Class 5 rapid is not a ride. It is a hydraulic nightmare described by experts as the washing machine of death, or the liquid wood chipper. It involves whirlpools that can suck a boat down to the bedrock and currents that move faster than a cheetah on espresso. Kevin, however, watched a few GoPro videos and concluded that since water is soft, how hard could it be? He went to an outfitter and bought the most expensive, high-performance whitewater kayak available. A sleek, responsive vessel that requires the reflexes of a ninja to keep upright. Crucially, he also bought a spray skirt. This is a neoprene seal that snaps tightly around the cockpit rim to keep water out. It essentially turns the boat and the paddler into a single, sealed unit. To get out of it, you have to calmly pull a release loop while underwater. This is called a wet exit, and it is the very first thing you learn in a pool. Kevin naturally skipped the pool. He arrived at the riverbank, looking like a neon-colored seal, and ignored the terrified warnings of local guides who suggested he try the kiddie pond first. He waved them off with the confidence of a man who has never felt the crushing weight of a cubic ton of water. He snapped his spray skirt on tight, really tight, and pushed off into the current. The first 30 seconds were majestic. He floated. He smiled. Then, gravity introduced him to the first rapid, a churning beast known locally as the Widowmaker. Kevin didn't even have time to dip his paddle. The river grabbed his boat, treated it like a bath toy, and flipped him upside down instantly. Now, a pro would execute an Eskimo roll, a hip snap maneuver to flip back up. Kevin didn't know an Eskimo from a dinner roll. He was now upside down, underwater, in freezing darkness, being dragged over boulders at 30 miles per hour. Panic, the enemy of survival, took over. He tried to push himself out of the boat, but the spray skirt, doing exactly what it was designed to do, held firm. He was trapped in a plastic coffin of his own making. In his flailing panic, he couldn't find the grab loop. He was essentially a passenger in a capsized vessel, banging his helmet against every rock in the riverbed while his lungs screamed for air that was only inches away but separated by a layer of neoprene he couldn't breach. The river didn't care about his credit score or his enthusiasm. It just held him under until the physics of oxygen deprivation took their course. By the time the kayak washed up in a calm eddy a mile downstream, Kevin was still inside, still upside down, and thoroughly removed from the gene pool. He proved that in the battle between a man with no skills and a river with no mercy, the river always wins, and it usually keeps the boat as a trophy. 5. Wind is a deceptive force. We feel a breeze and think, how refreshing, forgetting that the same air, when moving fast enough, can strip the roof off a house or, in this specific case, turn a human being into a high-speed, cautionary tale written in asphalt. Enter Brad, a speed junkie who found standard extreme sports too slow and regulations too boring. Brad discovered power kiting, a sport where you use a massive parachute-like kite to pull a buggy across the sand or a surfboard across the waves. Brad, a man of innovation and zero survival instinct, decided to remix the sport. He bought a 12-square-meter traction kite. To put that in perspective, a 12-meter kite is basically a small aircraft engine made of nylon. It generates enough torque to lift a grown man 20 feet into the air or drag a heavy beach buggy through deep sand. Brad looked at this monster and thought, you know what this needs? Rollerblades. Yes, inline skates. The footwear with the lowest friction coefficient known to man and brakes that consist of a tiny rubber eraser on the heel. He took his new toy to a long, abandoned stretch of coastal highway on a day when the wind forecast was small hurricane. The wind was gusting at 30 knots, conditions that would keep veteran kite surfers at the bar. Brad strapped on his skates, hooked the kite into his harness, and prepared for glory. He neglected to attach the safety leash, a mechanism designed to kill the kite's power in an emergency, because safety features are for people who plan on failing. He launched the kite. Usually you launch gently at the edge of the wind window. Brad launched it directly into the power zone, the center of the window where the pull is maximum and violent. The result was instantaneous. The kite caught the full force of the gale and jerked Brad forward with the acceleration of a railgun. He went from 0 to 40 miles per hour in the blink of an eye. Because he was on skates, he had no way to edge against the power. He wasn't piloting, he was cargo. He was skipping across the asphalt, his plastic wheels humming a death note. He tried to use the heel brake, but at that speed, the rubber just vaporized into black smoke. He was hurtling down the road, a helpless puppet attached to a sky monster. The terror set in when he realized the road wasn't infinite. It ended at a concrete seawall. He clawed at the harness, trying to unhook, but under the immense tension of the line, the hook was jammed solid. The kite, sensing his fear, seemed to pull harder. Brad covered the half-mile distance in seconds, a screaming blur of regret. He hit the seawall at highway speeds, a kinetic impact that physics simply does not allow a human body to survive. The kite, finally absolved of its burden, kept flying for another few minutes, dragging what was left of his ambitions up and over the wall. Brad wanted to feel the ultimate rush of speed, and he succeeded, right up until the moment he became a permanent fixture of the local infrastructure. 6. Have you ever watched a Red Bull Rampage highlight reel and thought, I could totally do that? No? Good. You have a functioning survival instinct. Travis, however, did not. Travis was not a mathematician, an engineer, or a stuntman. He was, however, a very enthusiastic mountain biker who had watched the Red Bull Rampage, an event where pros jump massive canyons, and decided, I can do that in my backyard. Travis found a ravine in the woods near his house. It was a nasty 15-meter gap filled with jagged limestone and poison ivy. He decided to jump it. He spent weeks building a takeoff ramp. It was a masterpiece of amateur carpentry, steep and sturdy, designed to launch him into the stratosphere. However, Travis made a critical error in his flight plan. He focused entirely on the up and completely ignored the down. In jump physics, you need a landing ramp, a steep, downward-sloping mound of dirt on the other side to catch the rider and convert their falling momentum into forward motion. If you land on flat ground from 30 feet up, your bike explodes and your spine compresses into a fine powder. Travis didn't build a landing ramp. He looked at the flat, hard-packed earth on the other side and figured, it's dirt, it's soft. He hauled his bike to the top of the run-in hill, adrenaline pumping, logic sleeping. He dropped in. The wind roared. He hit the ramp at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. He preloaded the suspension, popped off the lip, and soared into the air. For a brief, shining moment, Travis was a god. He was flying. But then, the parabola of his trajectory began to intersect with the harsh reality of geometry. He had calculated the distance, perhaps, but he hadn't calculated the arc. As he approached the other side, it became horrifyingly clear that he wasn't going to clear the gap to the flat ground. He was going to case it. In the biking world, casing means coming up short and smashing the frame of the bike into the edge of the landing. Travis slammed his front wheel directly into the vertical rock lip of the opposite cliff face. The bike stopped instantly, from 50 km/h to 0 in a millimeter. Travis, however, did not stop. Newton's first law of motion took over with a vengeance. He was catapulted over the handlebars like a human missile, his body absorbing all the kinetic energy that the bike had just shed. He flew headfirst, unprotected by a landing ramp or a prayer, and collided with a solid oak tree standing just beyond the edge. The impact was less of a thud and more of a crack that echoed through the forest. He didn't suffer. The lights went out before his brain could even process the word oops. Travis proved that in the world of physics, gravity doesn't care about your intentions, and if you build half a bridge, you only get half a life. 7. We live in an era where people believe that watching a 5-minute video on the internet is functionally equivalent to a 4-year degree, or, in this specific case, a decade of technical survival training. This brings us to the tragic but entirely predictable saga of Steve, a man who decided that rock climbing lessons were a scam invented by Big Safety to swindle honest thrill seekers out of their hard-earned cash. Steve wanted the glory of descending a sheer cliff face, but he didn't want the hassle of learning knots, friction coefficients, or basic physics. So he did what any modern genius would do. He went to an online marketplace and bought the Tactical Rappelling Starter Kit for $39.99. Now, for those in the know, a single, life-rated locking carabiner costs about $20, so a full kit at that price point is essentially a suicide note with a receipt attached. The package arrived, smelling faintly of cheap rubber and factory despair, and Steve was ecstatic. He watched exactly one tutorial video, skipping the boring intro where the instructor talked about safety backups and stopper knots, because Steve was a man of action, not a man of details. He drove to a local limestone quarry, hiked to the top of a 60-foot drop, and found a tree that looked sturdy enough to hold his ego. Here is where the physics of stupidity kicked in. Rappelling devices, like an ATC or a figure 8, work on the principle of friction. You thread the rope through them in a specific pattern to create drag, which slows your descent against gravity. If you thread it correctly, you are a controlled descender. If you thread it incorrectly, you are simply a heavy object attached to a greased lightning bolt. Steve, in his infinite wisdom, threaded the rope straight through the carabiner without creating a bite or a friction loop. He effectively built a pulley system with zero resistance. He clipped it to his harness, walked to the edge, and turned his back to the void. He took a deep breath, looked at the horizon, and leaned back for that classic cool guy silhouette. The moment his center of gravity passed the point of no return, Isaac Newton took the wheel. Without friction, there was nothing to stop him. He didn't rappel, he plummeted. He accelerated to terminal velocity in about 1.5 seconds. The rope zipped through his gloved hand so fast it melted the synthetic fabric, but that was the least of his problems. He fell the full length of the rope, 60 feet, in the blink of an eye. And because he had also skipped the part about tying a knot at the end of the rope, the end simply whistled through the device and waved goodbye. Steve continued his journey solo, impacting the rocky scree at the base of the cliff with the force of a dropped piano. The local climbing community was horrified, not just by the tragedy, but by the sheer, unadulterated incompetence of the setup. Steve proved that while you can buy the gear, you can't buy the laws of physics, and gravity has a strict zero-tolerance policy for people who skim the instruction manual. 8. There is a hierarchy of bad ideas in this world. At the bottom, there's eating gas station sushi. In the middle, there's texting your ex at 2 a.m. And right at the top, sitting on a throne of skulls, is building your own shark cage out of garden supplies. This brings us to Frank, a backyard welder and amateur marine biologist who felt that professional shark diving tours were a ripoff. Why pay $300, Frank reasoned, when I have a garage full of scrap metal and a dream? Frank decided to build his own shark-proof cage. Now, professional cages are built from high-grade, Schedule 40 aluminum or galvanized steel tubing, engineered by people who understand that sharks are basically biological torpedoes. Frank built his out of rusty rebar and, wait for it, chain link fencing. Yes, the same stuff used to keep golden retrievers in the backyard. He welded it all together, creating a box that looked less like a survival shelter and more like a lobster trap designed to catch a Darwin Award. He dragged this monstrosity out on his buddy's beat-up fishing boat, chummed the water with fish guts, and waited. Frank's logic was that sharks are just big fish, and chain link stops big dogs, so it should stop a fish. He failed to account for the fact that a great white shark can exert a bite pressure of over 4,000 pounds per square inch. When the guest of honor arrived, a 15-foot female great white, she wasn't even being aggressive, she was just curious. She swam up to investigate the weird, metallic, geometric shape floating in her living room. She gave it a test bump. In the ocean, a test bump from a 2-ton predator is like getting hit by a Volkswagen Beetle moving at 15 miles per hour. The cage didn't just dent, it folded. The welds, done by Frank after 3 beers, snapped instantly. The chain link mesh, designed for suburban security, popped like bubble wrap. Frank, inside the cage, suddenly found himself in a very small, very sharp metal burrito. The structural integrity of the cage collapsed inward, pinning him. The shark, startled by the noise of crunching metal, thrashed its tail and knocked the cage, and Frank, loose from the boat. The safety flotation barrels Frank had attached were insufficient for a cage now crumpled into a dense ball of steel and human. The contraption sank like a stone. Frank didn't get eaten. The shark actually swam away, probably wondering why the appetizers were wrapped in such hard packaging. Frank drowned, trapped inside his own invention, dragging himself to the bottom of the ocean in a prison of his own making. He wanted an up-close encounter with nature, and he got it. Right before nature showed him exactly why engineers go to college and why good enough is never good enough when apex predators are involved. 9. Caves are nature's way of saying, "You do not belong here." They are dark, cold, wet, and actively trying to kill you. But for Derek, a man whose sense of adventure was matched only by his complete lack of preparation, a cave was just a theme park ride without the line. Derek discovered an entrance to a subterranean river system in a remote part of the state. Most people would call a speleologist, or, better yet, stay home and watch Netflix. Derek called his buddy, who wisely bailed, and grabbed a $12 inflatable inner tube from Walmart. His plan? Chill float, bro. He hiked in, wearing swimming trunks and flip-flops, armed with a single light source, the flashlight on his iPhone. He launched his tube into the black, icy water. The current was gentle at first, lulling him into a false sense of security. He floated through the darkness, snapping blurry photos for a social media post he would never make. "This is epic," he probably whispered, listening to the drip, drip, drip of limestone. However, Derek didn't know what a sump or siphon was. In hydrogeology, a sump is where the cave ceiling dips down below the water level, creating a submerged tunnel. To pass it, you need scuba gear, specialized training, and a death wish. To avoid it, you need to know the cave. Derek knew nothing. About 20 minutes in, the ceiling began to lower. The headroom went from 10 feet to 5, then to 2. The current, meanwhile, began to accelerate, funneling into the narrower passage like water down a drain. Derek realized too late that the chill float was actually a conveyor belt into the abyss. He tried to paddle back, but inner tubes are aerodynamically designed to spin in circles, not to travel upstream against a forceful current. The ceiling scraped his nose. The water pressed him flat. His phone flashlight illuminated the terrifying reality. The rock wall ahead descended straight into the water. There was no air pocket. He hit the siphon. The force of the river sucked him under the rock face like a spider down a drain. He was pulled into the submerged tunnel, tumbling in absolute darkness, his inflatable tube compressing and jamming him against the stone roof of the underwater passage. There was no way to turn around, no way to fight the thousands of gallons of water pushing him forward into the suffocating dark. He drowned alone, underground, in the cold grip of the earth, proving that while ignorance is bliss, in a cave, ignorance is a terminal condition. He treated the underworld like a lazy river, and the underworld responded by revoking his membership to the living. 10. Instagram has a lot to answer for. It convinces people that life is just a series of aesthetic backdrops waiting for a filter, and that safety is secondary to the vibe. Enter Tyler, a 24-year-old aspiring influencer who wanted the ultimate profile picture. Him, relaxing in a hammock, suspended hundreds of feet over a canyon. It's a popular shot, usually taken by professional climbers using dynamic ropes, redundant anchor points, and gear rated to hold a minivan. Tyler, however, was on a budget. He bought a standard camping hammock online and headed to the hardware store for the mounting gear. He stared at the wall of carabiners. On the left, he saw certified climbing carabiners rated for 24 kilonewtons, about $5,000 lbs, costing $15 each. On the right, he saw utility carabiners meant for holding keys, or maybe a potted plant, costing $19.99. Tyler, Performing the mental gymnastics of a madman, thought, metal is metal, and bought the cheap ones. He hiked out to a gorge with a 300-foot drop, a breathtaking void that demanded respect. He found 2 sturdy trees growing out of the cliff edge. He rigged his setup using paracord and his keychain clips. The view was perfect. The sun was setting. It was golden hour. Tyler climbed into the hammock. The cheap aluminum clips held his static weight, about 170 pounds. He pulled out his phone, extended the selfie stick, and smiled. But then, he needed to adjust his position to get the lighting just right. He shifted his weight. He bounced. Just a little. This introduced a concept known as dynamic load. A 170-pound object dropping even 2 inches generates force exponentially higher than its static weight. The keychain carabiner, stamped with the words, "Not for climbing," in letters apparently too small for Tyler's ego to read, experienced a catastrophic shear failure. The gate pin snapped. The hook opened. In a fraction of a second, Tyler went from chill vibes to free fall. There was no time to scream, no time to regret the $26 he saved on hardware. He fell 300 feet, still wrapped in his nylon cocoon, a flailing gift-wrapped package of hubris plummeting toward the riverbed below. The photo he took was likely blurry, but the lesson he left behind was crystal clear. If your life depends on a piece of metal, make sure it costs more than a cup of coffee. Tyler achieved the viral fame he wanted, but only as a cautionary tale in a manufacturing safety manual about why you should never trust your life to equipment designed to hold a janitor's keys. Let's be real. The only difference between you and these guys is luck. You've survived something remarkably stupid, haven't you? Confess your closest Darwin moment in the comments below. I'm liking the most embarrassing. Hit like if you're currently alive by accident and subscribe so you don't end up as a script for my next video.